Story 1. DoorDash was the activity that I was engaging in during the night on a regular Friday after my college classes had ended for the day. One of my usual routines consisted of rushing on the weekends in order to assist me in paying for all of my living expenditures while I was attending college. Things got off to a good start. I completed a significant number of orders and accomplished a good deal. After that, it came to a standstill. After the major dinner rush, there were very few orders that came in, and the ones that did come in were extremely low paying. In other words, they were orders that were a waste of time. However, after driving about aimlessly for an hour, an order arrived that wasn't too bad. This was the turning point. Despite the fact that it was 8 miles distant, the payment was entirely justified. It is not ludicrous, but it is sufficient to prevent it from feeling like a rip-off, which is something that a lot of the other ones were. Following my acceptance of the order, I dashed into the restaurant to retrieve the bag, and then I leapt into my vehicle and began driving. Given that the map indicated that it would take 30 minutes, I believe that this was the longest of any orders that I had completed up until this time. The majority of the homes were located in close proximity to the college. At a distance of 15 to 20 minutes, the landscape essentially turned into a series of stark fields of grass. When I reached that 20-minute mark, it turned out to be exactly that, a small number of dwellings, the majority of which were located in the middle of fields of crops, and nothing else. For the last 10 minutes of the journey, we travelled along this deserted road that ran beside these farms. After that, I arrived at the residence. There was a dirt driveway that connected to the road, and it led through a big field towards a little home that was located in the very rear of the field. Travelling through the field had a very creepy feeling about it. I am not the type of person who gets nervous for no apparent reason, but this gave me a different feeling. I was able to get further away from the road, and the only thing I could hear was the quiet rumbling of my car as it left the road. After preparing the luggage and parking the car in the front, I exited the vehicle with the engine still running. The night was peaceful and the house was dark. The only light that was on was the porch light, which illuminated the exterior of the house. I made my way through the untidy grass and made my way up to the porch area, where I knocked on the door. During the time that I was waiting, I went back and glanced at my car, which was parked in the dark and had a field of pitch darkness behind it. 1 instant has passed. After that, I knocked once again, but there was no reaction. There was not even the suggestion that somebody was there. The peculiarity of the circumstance was brought to my attention in a reasonably short amount of time. The windows do not have any lights on. Upon closer inspection, the house appeared to be in a state of disrepair. The fact that I had an order for this location, combined with the fact that the porch light was on, was the only thing that led me to believe that it could not be done away with. As I glanced at the light, I couldn't help but wonder why it was the sole light in the room. By some strange coincidence, I was able to identify the top piece of the case, which contained a low-cost solar battery embedded within it. It was nothing more than a light that turned on automatically in the evening after being given a charge during the day. In other words, nobody had to be present in order to activate it. On the other hand, just as I was putting everything together, I became aware of a rumbling sound coming from behind me. At that moment, I looked around and saw an automobile going down the dirt path, approaching my vehicle from behind. Once a man emerged from the vehicle, I stood there and stared at the headlights of the vehicle. The question of whether or not this was his order was yelled out from the porch, but he did not respond. He did not move or speak at all. He simply stood perfectly still next to his vehicle. As I started to gain a better understanding of how terrible the situation probably was, I experienced a surge of adrenaline. In the midst of the night silence, I was merely reminded that there was no one present to provide assistance. I found myself lost in the middle of a field, sandwiched between a house that was deserted and an unknown person. I let go of the bag and rushed off the porch, dashing behind the house and straight into the field of grass. This was a split-second reaction that was completely natural. The man was approaching from behind me when I turned around and saw him. Despite my frantic efforts, I continued to run. As I moved further out from the center of the area, the grass became more dense and higher, eventually obstructing all of my views in every direction. During that time, I was aware that the person had no chance of following me. In the event that the man was still looking for me, I slowed down, took a moment to regain my breath, and began to go through the crops with caution while making an effort to be silent. After some time, I was able to reach the yard of another individual, and from there I was able to reach a road where I had sufficient signal to call for assistance. When the police arrived to pick me up, they went to check on my vehicle. However, by that time the man had already left. That being said, I was taken aback by the fact that my vehicle had not been stolen and the bag of food was still sitting on the porch of the house that had been abandoned. However, this could only indicate that the man had other motives, which were most likely much more serious than simply robbing me. Story 2. When I was on my way back, after spending the holidays with my family, I was enjoying a road trip when this unfortunate event occurred. The tickets to the location I was traveling to this year were significantly more expensive than they had been in the past for some reason, despite the fact that I am not typically one to drive for more than a couple of hours distance. I would have had to pay more than $1,000 for a round-trip flight that only traveled to a few states in the opposite direction. I had everything planned out in such a way that I would arrive at my house a few days before I was required to return to work. However, a snowstorm arrived on the day that I was intended to leave, which meant that I had to remain in the area for an additional 2 days before I could finally begin the journey. As a result of the fact that the holiday rush had passed, the highways were devoid of traffic, and the majority of the journey was quite far from major cities. One of the most challenging aspects was overcoming boredom and keeping awake throughout the day. There was no difficulty whatsoever throughout the first 8 or so hours of the day. However, the snow on the drive kept me awake and attentive, despite the fact that I was exhausted. I had a hotel reservation in a tiny town that was just 2 hours ahead of me, and it was approximately 10 o'clock at night. A small light appeared in my rearview mirror while I was driving. However, it turned out to be the headlights of someone who was following me. In fact, it was the first person I had seen on the road in more than an hour. As they approached, their lights were rapidly expanding, which indicated that they were approaching at a very rapid pace. After a short while, I was able to recognize that it was in fact a gigantic van of some kind. Due to the fact that there was only a one-lane road, I was unable to move out of their way, yet I anticipated that they would still make an effort to avoid me because of how quickly they were traveling. However, as soon as they reached the rear of my vehicle, they matched my speed and continued to follow directly behind me. Following a little period of time, I became aware that they were not attempting to circumvent me. We continued to drive in this manner for close to 10 minutes. It had a somewhat unsettling effect. But despite the fact that we were the only ones on the road, this enormous vehicle was following closely behind me. In addition, the distance that was being followed was not typical. When I looked in my rearview mirror, I couldn't even make out their front bumper or license plate because they were so close. It's possible that I was fast to feel uneasy about it, but when I saw an exit for a gas station, I decided to turn off, in the hopes that they would stay on the road and I would be able to put some distance between us. Nevertheless, they remained right behind me as I pulled off and down the ramp leading to the exit. When I arrived at the gas station, I left my vehicle parked at one of the pumps. When I was standing behind the pump, the van pulled up. What was going on was completely beyond my comprehension at this point. One part of me believed that this was something undesirable, while another part of me believed that I was simply exaggerating the situation. Because I was aware that this was the only gas station that had been open for almost 30 minutes, it was not improbable that they also required gas. Before getting out of my car to fill up my gas tank, I turned off the engine and had a glance around. There was a notice that read "Closed" hanging from the door of the retail section of the gas station, and the lights were turned out. I turned my head to the sides and saw nothing but a pitch-black void. There are no homes, there are no buildings. There is only one road that passes across the snow-covered field that is all that is there. I looked in the mirror in my room. At this moment, a man was waiting outside the van, filling it up with gas. As a result, I exited the vehicle and started doing the same thing. At the same time that the numbers on the gas meter were slowly ticking, the man hurriedly replaced his pump and secured his gas cap. I turned around and saw that guy was making his way to the back of his van. After that, I became aware of the loud ratcheting sound that was produced by the back door being opened. There was something in that instant that urged me to leave that place, and it may have been a gut sensation or it could have been just instinct. Almost immediately as I removed the pump from my vehicle, 3 individuals were rushing toward me from the direction of the back of the van. They were not even a second earlier. I hurriedly got into my vehicle and locked the doors, just as one of them grabbed the handle and attempted to rip it open. A moment later, I dropped the pump on the ground and locked the doors. When I was trying to get the automobile on, I was trembling and moving as quickly as I could. The 3 of them went around and tried each door, but then they instantly ran back to their van before I had even had the opportunity to get away from them. As soon as I did, however, I noticed that they were driving away shortly after that, moving in the opposite direction, along the path that we had come from. Even though I informed the authorities about what had occurred, I never received a call from them with any new information. My opinion is that it is rather evident that they were attempting to kidnap people while it was nighttime on the broad roadway that was devoid of any people. The fact that the entire operation was carried out with such self-assurance and, for lack of a better phrase, professionalism is just horrifying. It seems that as soon as they understood that I was safely inside my vehicle and that it was not going to be an easy task, they ran away from the scene without even having to communicate with one another. It seemed as though they had done it a great number of times before. What would have transpired if they had been successful in capturing me? No, I'm not sure. But I strongly encourage everyone to take the time to learn from my errors, because you might not be as fortunate as I was. Story 3. As I traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast, I was delivering a truckload of goods to a company located on the West Coast. It is a path that I have traveled across the country on numerous occasions in the past. Over the course of about 20 years, I have been working as a truck driver, and each and every one of these drives is exactly the same. The roads, the truck stops, and everything else are all the same. In spite of this, I haven't experienced anything particularly extraordinary in the past 20 years. There have been a few strange situations that have occurred to me, but they have never resulted in anything significant. Therefore, when I was driving down this route once more, I did not have any concerns in my mind. The day was nothing more than a typical work day. I had been driving for around 20 hours when I noticed that a storm was approaching and causing my speed to decrease. Additionally, it was late, and by that time, I had already begun searching for the next truck stop where I could sleep. On the other hand, as I was driving, I suddenly noticed a light appear behind me. If I had been driving on a road that was level and straight, I would have been able to see them approaching through my rear-view mirror. Nevertheless, all of a sudden, they were actually following me. I was not sure what had happened, Perhaps they had merely turned on their lights or anything else, but in a very short amount of time, they made their way to the rear, to the point where they were fully obscured by the trailer. I continued to keep my eyes on them till they were so near. The only thing I could make out was the reflection of their headlights off of the back. Following that, their lights went off. I continued to drive at the same speed and kept looking back at my mirrors to determine whether or not they were still following me, but there was no way for me to find out. Someone's decision to switch off their lights in the midst of a severe storm was completely beyond comprehension, and the fact that they were following me so closely was equally absurd. Thank goodness, a sign indicated that there was a truck stop only 5 miles ahead of us. At the very least, I was aware that I was moving closer and closer to escaping whatever it was. However, as a truck driver, it is difficult not to consider the potential that it was an attempt at robbery, especially when you are traveling alone on the road at night. I did not want to jump to conclusions based on merely some strange conduct, but it is difficult not to think about it. During the last 5 kilometers, I did not notice any indications of them following behind me. In spite of the fact that I couldn't really see anything, I continued to feel anxious. However, as I approached the truck stop, I noticed that I was beginning to feel less anxious. I pulled in and attempted to check my mirrors to see if they had followed me, but due to the rain and the lack of lighting, it was far too difficult to determine whether or not they had followed. There were a few trucks at the petrol pumps, but other than that, the truck stop was almost completely vacant. I parked my vehicle in the middle of the parking lot after pulling over to the side. I opened the door of the truck and leaned my head out, glancing along the side of the trailer. After waiting for a moment and getting some of my belongings organized, I got closer to the trailer. In a matter of seconds, I was completely saturated from the rain, but from what I could tell, there was no car following behind me. After closing the door, I finally had a sense of relief. I then proceeded to get my pillow and blanket from the passenger side of the truck, lock the doors, switch off the truck, and attempt to get some shut-eye. Raindrops pounding on the metal roof made it simple to fall asleep because they blocked out any sounds that might have been coming from other trucks pulling in and out of the parking lot. When I finally opened my eyes, however, I had the impression that I had only been asleep for a few minutes. As I looked about, I noticed that it was still dark outside and the storm was just as dangerous as it had been before. The truck was shaken by a loud bang, but I was unable to check my mirrors before it happened. My eyes widened in surprise. While I was peering out the back of the trailer, I grabbed for the door handle and opened it. After opening it, I could only make out the outline of a car that had its headlights turned off, and there were 2 men moving around in front of it. This was all I could see through the rain. I was so terrified that I was hesitant to enter the room and confront them. And while I sat there in that moment of doubt, the door abruptly smashed against my body, forcing me to move back even more into the driver's seat. Another someone was standing outside, yelling at me to remain in the same location and then slamming the door shut once more. He stuffed his right hand into the hoodie he was wearing. It was impossible for me to attempt anything because there were 2 more men running behind the truck. Despite the fact that I was sitting still, I could feel the truck shaking. The man who was standing at my door was monitoring my every move. He didn't even avert his gaze for a couple of seconds. This continued for a few minutes at a time. Then they made a mad dash back to their vehicle and sped off. My state of mind remained in a state of astonishment as I saw their vehicle vanish onto the road. I made a call to the authorities and filed a report, but I never received any information regarding the identities of the males. All I know is that if I had been any less vigilant and had simply tried to drive away at the first sight of the men, I probably would not have been able to make it out of the situation as securely as I did. Story 4. In 2019, I worked as a delivery driver for a pizza restaurant that was located close to my school. In order to be able to finance my automobile and my rent, I would work after school on the majority of the days. Although it was not a particularly good job in any way, it was sufficient to allow me to make it through college without going into full and utter destitution. In the beginning, this night was not much different from the majority of others. I arrived at my place of employment at 6 o'clock and worked consecutively for 3 hours. After taking a break for lunch, I resumed my work at 9:30. Following the completion of the following order, I started making my way to the location. Although the location did not appear to be a house, the path that it led me to take in order to arrive at the destination was not what I had anticipated. It carried me further away from the vicinity of the town, away from the majority of homes and shops, and into a commercial district. There were only a few small office buildings in the area. There was nothing else there. I was driving down the road and I couldn't really identify what any of the addresses were. As a result, I just followed the directions on the GPS and prayed that it would lead me to the correct parking lot. When I arrived, I drove through a parking lot that was quite lengthy until I reached the front of the building and was able to read the address. Even though it was identical to the one that was ordered, there was a problem with it. Each and every parking spot in the lot was vacant. The office building was completely empty, and there was no indication that anyone was inside. Not even the lamps were on. After confirming the address twice, I was under the impression that there must have been an error. However, everything was in order. Even though I tried searching for it on Google, I was unable to find any nearby locations that had the same address. This was the end. After putting my vehicle in park, I exited it, and before approaching the entrance, I took a quick look around. The front door was made of glass, and it had a black tint covering it. After making a knock, I stepped back and waited for a moment. When the door was finally opened, it was just a moment later. The individual in question was a man of middle age who was dressed in fairly casual attire and had a slight smile on his face. Suddenly he became too thrilled and expressed his happiness that the meal had finally arrived. He also mentioned that everyone was suffering from hunger. When I peered behind him, I did not see anyone else, and there was only one light on in the middle of the hallway. However, I chose to disregard this and instead focused on telling him his amount. The fact that he promptly indicated that everyone else was in the recreation area on the 3rd floor for a corporate party indicates that he must have picked up on the fact that I was seeking for anything. Despite the fact that I smiled in an attempt to be nice, the man was talking with an excessive level of passion. In fact, it was so intense that it nearly seemed as like he was trying to fake it. A $10 tip was included in the cash that he presented to me for the pizzas after he brought out his wallet. Nevertheless, as I was taking the money, he approached me and asked for a favor. He wanted assistance in transporting the pizzas to the 3rd story. The individual had placed me in an unusual circumstance. Having already accepted the big tip, it seemed like it would be the only thing that would be appropriate to assist him. On the other hand, transporting a few pizzas is not exactly a challenge, and it did not appear to be required in any way, shape or form. While he was making his way to a door that led to some stairs, he began walking without me having yet responded to him. He urged me to join him as he took the stairs. It was uncertain whether or not I would follow him into the stairwell, so I kept my distance and followed him behind. However, as soon as I walked in, I was hit by a chilly gust of air and observed that all of the lights were turned off. The entrance to the stairs was illuminated solely by the dim light that emanated from the corridor. After realizing that I had not proceeded to pursue him, the man began to make his way up, but he eventually halted. As soon as he realized that I wasn't going to proceed any farther, he turned around and made a witty remark about the lights. However, shortly after that, his smile vanished. When he came storming down toward me with anger in his eyes, there was no hesitancy on his part during his approach. I quickly hurled the pizzas onto the ground before racing out of the door and into the corridor. After that, I made a beeline for the exit and sprinted to my vehicle. After walking back inside and slamming the front door shut, I observed the man come partially out of the doors and then go back inside. Following my arrival in a new parking lot, I did not waste any time in contacting the authorities. As soon as they arrived, the man had already fled, and because he had paid with cash, there was no way to determine who he actually was when they arrived. There was no one else on the third story of the office building, and the building itself was completely empty. Consequently, it is evident that it was really a trap of some kind. On the third floor, I have no idea what he had prepared for me, and I sincerely hope that no one ever has to find out what he had prepared. Story 5. I used to be a delivery person for Chinese food for a restaurant in the area. I had just become a teenager and was in my final year of high school at the time, and I knew that whatever job I obtained would not be for more than a year or two. For the most part, this employment was fairly typical of first jobs or jobs in the food service industry. There were days that were sluggish and monotonous, and there were days that were busy and stressful. However, as the person who drove the delivery truck, I was always grateful that I was not working in the store where I would have to deal with crowds of people. This evening, I didn't get started until 6 o'clock. It was a Friday, and I was working a late shift from 6 to 12 o'clock. After I had finished punching in, I immediately began delivering orders non-stop for the next 2 hours, and there was no time for me to take a breath in between each one. Even though the number of orders was beginning to decrease by 8 o'clock, I still had a few more to deliver before I could have my lunch break. Therefore, I went ahead and took the 3 orders and set out to complete them before 9 o'clock. Although the first one was somewhat close, the subsequent 2 were further away. Given that our town is not completely congested, this is not an unusual occurrence. On arriving at the second residence, I handed it over to the owner, and then I proceeded to the last destination. Even though it was 10 minutes away from where I was, the tag indicated that it had not yet been paid for. During this travel, the only thing that was going through my mind was the break that I would get thereafter. This evening, I was exhausted more than usual due to the fact that I had been going back and forth for 3 hours in a row. As soon as I pulled into the area, I followed the GPS until I reached the back portion, which was where the entire vibe abruptly shifted. On the side of the road, which was covered by dense shrubs and overgrown lawns, there were a few modest houses that were hardly visible. I went onto a road that was very thin and had cracked pavement and potholes. After the GPS informed me that I had arrived, I braked the car, but I was unable to locate a property. After turning on my brights, I was able to distinctly make out the silhouette of a little house that was located quite a distance away from the road that I was on. When I glanced at the grass that was leading up to it, I made the realization that there was in fact a driveway. However, it was completely covered by vines and tall grass. If it weren't for the fact that I had noticed the home first, I never would have seen it. With the knowledge that I would not even be able to drive on it, I put the car in park, got out of the car with the bag, and started walking through the driveway that was completely overgrown. I was unable to believe how terrible it was to have to walk through it. It seems inconceivable to me that anyone would let their driveway to deteriorate to this degree. However, when I got closer, I was able to see more of the rest of the house. The driveway appeared to be in the same condition as the mobile home, which was a very little structure. It was extremely similar to a trailer home. Over the windows, vines were growing and vegetation covered every inch of the house, which was on the verge of falling apart. I was aware that something was awry as I made my way up to the front entrance of the building. I was aware of it both in my head and in my gut. Nevertheless, I was just a young person with my first job, and I was terrified of losing it. As a result, I felt as though I had to fulfill my duties, which included delivering the order to this address. I forced myself to ignore all of my negative emotions and then I knocked on the door. Almost immediately, I became aware of footsteps approaching the entrance. Once it was unlocked, a young woman was seen standing behind it. In the beginning, when the lighting was dark, she appeared to be fairly normal, and I felt a tremendous feeling of relief. However, it took only a few more seconds for her to realize that her typical appearance was disturbingly out of place with the state of the house. It was inconceivable that she could be so well dressed and well cared for when she was residing in this place. During the time that these ideas were frantically racing through my head, she opened the screen door and said, in a tone that was eerily calm, "Please come in." When I was in that moment, everything hit me. After taking a few steps backwards, I came to the conclusion that I needed to go immediately. After turning around, I heard a thump coming from the side of the house. It was only a second after I had started to leave that I heard the sound. When I turned around, I saw two men racing out from behind the house and rushing through the bushes in the direction of me. Everything I was carrying was dropped, and I began to run. In an effort to make my way through the dense grass and vines, I did all in my power. When I finally made it to the end of the driveway, however, I fell to the ground after tripping over something while I was walking. As I heard their footsteps becoming closer to me, I rushed up to catch up. During the time that I was running straight to my car and turning it on, I couldn't even bring myself to look back. They instantly came to a stop and ran back to the location from which they had originated. My entire body was still shaking from the adrenaline, and I drove away from the scene of the crime while turning the car around. Naturally, I informed my supervisor about what had occurred, and he strongly suggested that I make a report to the authorities and call them. The realization that he was simply concerned with my well-being and not the order brought me a great deal of relief. If things had turned out differently, it would have been a terrible thing to happen when we look back on it. After conducting an exhaustive investigation and conducting interviews with both myself and my supervisor, the police were eventually unable to locate any of the individuals in question. The land that I was on the other hand, was actually owned by the state, and the trespassing sign that was located at the entrance of the road had been dug up and thrown into the long grass. There is no information available regarding their goals, yet it appears that the most obvious hypothesis is most likely the answer. It is my sincere wish that no one else will have to experience what I did. On the other hand, if they do, I hope they are as fortunate as I was and are able to escape. Story 6. This evening I found myself with some spare time, and after drinking a few cups of coffee earlier in the day, I decided to put the energy I had gained to good use by going out and earning some money. On my route to my next delivery, I was driving on the highway while delivering packages for DoorDash. It was ridiculously late. The streets were devoid of traffic and the night was quite tranquil. This was the ideal situation for any delivery driver. On the other hand, my phone began to buzz when I was on my way there. It was the client who picked up the phone. However, they hung up on me before I had the opportunity to respond. The fact that it only rang for a couple of seconds led me to believe that it must have been an accident. For the sake of safety, however, I redialed their number. The phone rang for a long, but they did not pick up the phone. The rest of the drive was spent with me not giving it any thought, so I just shook my head and blew it off. After exiting the freeway, I drove into the neighborhood where I was staying. It was a road that was extremely typical, with buildings that were typical. As soon as I arrived at the residence where I was supposed to deliver something, I parked my vehicle directly in the driveway and began heading up to their porch. During the time that I was putting the bag down, I saw that the front door was slightly unlocked. I did not know if it was intended for me or not, so I softly knocked on the door and announced that I was delivering their dinner. I did this because I was unsure at the time. As soon as I did, I became aware of a sound that was somewhat unsettling coming from the direction of the hallway. It was a muffled thump that was virtually identical to the sound of my knock. It was like if someone was pounding on a door frame. I opened the front door wider and shouted out once more with a little bit of trepidation. I was at a loss for words, so I simply reiterated what I had already said, which was that I was delivering their dinner. The silence lasted for a few moments. Subsequently, I became aware of a door opening from the rear of the home, and a man appeared from around the corner. Despite the fact that he appeared upset and agitated, I was unable to determine whether or not it was because of me or something else. Without uttering a single word, the individual made his way down the corridor and approached the doorway that I was standing at. He then began to reach for the bag. After them, I once more heard those thumps coming from the opposite end of the corridor. Because I was perplexed, I looked past him. As well as that, he turned and stared, then abruptly turned around and stared at me, coming to the realization that I had also heard it. "Will everything be all right?" I inquired with concern. A second time, the sound reverberated through the walls, and the man seemed to be staring at me in a manner that suggested he was trying to figure out what to do. The tone of his voice was almost demanding as he asked, "Why don't you bring the food inside for me as well?" I took the bag in my hands with trepidation. Nevertheless, I immediately came to the conclusion that this was a poor idea. I had the impression that I was in danger and that I needed to follow him, but at the same time, I had a sensation that if I did, I wouldn't be able to escape from that place. When I hesitated, the expression on the guy's face revealed that he was much more agitated, even more so, angry. After that, he reached out and took the food straight out of my hands, and then he slammed the door in my face. To my utter astonishment, I stood there and listened as his footsteps made their way down the corridor. Then the pounding came to an end. At that time, I was unable to do anything else, so I left the porch as quickly as I could and made my way to my vehicle. Following that particular shift, I terminated my employment with DoorDash and ultimately informed the authorities about the extremely unsettling situation. My belief is that the fact that the man attempted to convince me to go inside his house was the factor that ultimately led to my decision to report it. It is possible that I would not have considered there to be sufficient evidence to take any action if it were not for it. Following a number of hours, I was informed by the police that the individual had denied the presence of any other individuals and had rebuffed their request to examine his residence. Speculation was the only option left at that moment because there was nothing else to do. I have a strong suspicion that something genuinely terrible was taking place, and it is possible that he was prepared to do the same thing to me. However, I do not believe that we will ever know for certain. Story 7. I had just returned from seeing a buddy who lives an hour away, and I was heading back. It was approximately 2 in the morning when I finally left because we had lost track of time. I was really exhausted, and the journey was uninteresting to say the least. A significant portion of the journey back home consisted of a lengthy and unwinding route that appeared to be devoid of any other vehicles. For the first 20 minutes, I was the only person there, and I was staring at the unending pavement in front of me while attempting to keep my eyes open. However, at that moment, my headlights unexpectedly illuminated something that was located on the road in front of me. At first, I was unable to determine what it was. However, as I came closer, I was forced to slow down and eventually come to a complete stop. In the middle of the road was blocked by a semi-truck that was stopped there, and it was blocking both lanes. For a little moment, I sat there completely oblivious to what I was actually observing. The distance between us and the town was at least 30 minutes at this point on the route. Outside, there was nothing to be found. At the event that there was an emergency of any kind, the only reason anyone would slow down at a location such as this would be, it appeared to me that there could have been sufficient space for me to maneuver around the trailer if I had looked to the right of the truck. However, there was a steep hill on the shoulder that would have made it quite hazardous for me to drive on. I was unable to drive between the trees on the opposite side of the truck because they were too close together. After staying there for a whole minute, I came to the conclusion that this must be an urgent situation and that the best and possibly only choice available to me was to check on them. After getting out of my vehicle, I started going in the direction of the front of the trailer, remembering how calm it was outdoors. It seemed as though the night was entirely silent and devoid of any activity. As I made my way to the front of the vehicle, I became aware that the light in the driver's cabin was on. I approached the door, gave it a little knock, and then shouted out to inquire about their well-being. I wondered if they were okay. It was impossible for me to see anything through the window because it was so high that I couldn't see through it from the ground. Following a few seconds, there was still no reaction. Once more I yelled out, but there was not even the slightest indication of any activity occurring inside. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that something was really wrong with this. I peered down the road ahead of me, and then I looked back at the route I had come from. I saw nothing but fog in the distance, which served to remind me of how far away I was from everyone else. After grabbing the side of the door and lifting myself up onto the steps, I peeked through the window to see what was going on inside. There were items dispersed all over the place, giving the impression that they had crashed or something similar, which made the entire cabin a complete and utter disaster. Still, there was no one inside. It was then that I became aware that the door on the opposite side was ajar. After stepping back onto the road, I started heading around the truck to investigate the open door. However, I came to a complete halt when I noticed a man in the forest who was walking up the side of the hill. In addition to being tall and having hair that reached his shoulders, he appeared to be very untidy. "Hey, my man, how are you doing?" I was not made to look at by the man. Just like that, he proceeded to continue climbing out of the trees and onto the road. In the dim light that was coming from my headlights, I noticed that his garments were covered in dark red stains all over, and the dirt and grime that coated his face was everywhere. My assumption was that he was obviously not doing well, so I volunteered to assist him, but he continued to ignore me completely. But that was before I mentioned that I could contact 911 on his behalf. Without any delay, he halted his movement and turned his gaze in my direction, maintaining eye contact for a few extended seconds. The tone of his voice was deep and menacing when he said, "I'm fine." After putting an end to my conversation, I saw him get into the truck. I then made a hasty return to my vehicle. When the truck began to drive away, I immediately turned around and drove back to the residence of my friend. Once I arrived, I dialed 911 and provided as much information as I could remember giving. The case was never pursued any farther than that, which is not unexpected. There is still a mystery surrounding what took place on that road, and it continues to terrify me to this day. Due to the fact that the vehicle was parked in such a manner which included the cabin appearing to be in a state of disarray, I believe that something or someone compelled them to come to a stop. Whatever transpired after that is up for debate, but the man I saw most likely was not the truck driver who had been there from the beginning. I believe that we can all make an educated guess as to what most likely took place. In the woods beneath the road. Story 8. I work for my father at the construction company that he owns and operates. In addition to managing the working locations that the workers are at, he is in charge of a yard and a warehouse that is stocked with materials. Considering that I was only 17 years old at the time, my employment essentially consisted of being the errand boy. The items would be transported back and forth, and I would pick up whatever that was required. However, depending on the nature of the activity, certain supplies might be required to be there before the workers came. This is because the workers would require them in order to get started immediately in the morning. Because of this, there were times when I had to start working extremely early, like 2 or 3 in the morning, in order to guarantee that I would be able to deliver everything on time during the hectic periods. It is obvious that this occurred solely over the summer, when I was not required to attend school. Hence, I had no justification for being unable to work. However, I enjoyed doing the deliveries early because it was a tranquil environment, and I didn't have to deal with anyone telling me what to do to complete the task. On this particular day, I arrived at the warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning, loaded up, and then began making my way to the location where the work was going to be done. A structure on the outskirts of our town that was rather old and possibly even deserted was the subject of the restoration work. Upon my arrival, I noticed that there was a truck parked directly outside. It appeared as though there was no one in the vicinity, and its lights were turned off. On account of the fact that it was far too early for anyone to be working, I did not anticipate seeing any cars in this area. After I had parked and exited the vehicle, I approached it and noticed that it was not a vehicle belonging to the organization. The windows were tinted, so I was unable to see what was going on inside. Turning around, I gazed at the structure, attempting to determine whether or not anyone was present. Even when I yelled out to see if anyone was inside, I did not receive any response. Because I was experiencing some unease about it, I took out my phone and dialed my father's number. The phone rang for a minute before going to the voicemail system. After determining that it was most likely just a worker's personal truck that they had left there, I walked back to my vehicle and began unloading the items. It should have taken about 1 hour. Once I was back inside, I started driving away from the scene. On the other hand, as I was leaving the area, I looked in my rearview mirror, and all of a sudden, the lights on the truck turned on. I came to a complete stop on the side of the road and watched as the vehicle began to reverse out of the parking spot. I almost brought my brakes to a complete stop. Always present was a person who was within the room. Due to the fact that I was aware of this, I was certain that this could not have been a worker because they would have definitely reacted to me. Watching them make their way out of the parking lot and onto the road was something I did while I sat there. I hurriedly grabbed my phone and called my father's number once more into the phone. I turned my head to glance over and noticed that the truck had parked just next to me as I was waiting for him to pick me up. My eyes were fixed on their window, and I was aware that someone was probably looking at me from behind it as well. In an attempt to get back onto the road, I threw my phone onto the seat and started driving ahead. However, the truck was quick to match my speed and prevented me from getting back onto the road. On the other hand, there was no other place for me to go. Trees could be seen to my left. It was the truck that was obstructing my path to my right. I started to feel anxious. I attempted to do a backwards drive by putting the car in reverse. Until they tapped the side of my car, the truck continued to behave in the same manner. This caused me to lose control of my vehicle, go totally off the shoulder, and crash into a tree. The truck came to a rapid stop just at the top of the road, giving the impression that they were going to exit the vehicle. However, the brake lights immediately turned off once more, and they put the vehicle back into their drive position, as well as sped off. I was approached by a man who came out of another automobile that had pulled over to the side of the road just 20 seconds later. He inquired as to whether or not I was having any problems. At the time, I was unaware of his name. Nonetheless, he was one of the workers who had just arrived at the location where the work was being done. Although he was only present for the final moments of the event, he stated that he recognized the other truck. He stated that it was Samuel's truck, who was another worker that my father had employed a few months previously. It was discovered that a large number of tools and materials had been taken from the construction site, which amounted to approximately $10,000. Furthermore, that was only from that single evening. It is possible that over the course of the past few months, he has been stealthily stealing a few items at a time. It is my belief that Samuel believed that if I saw his truck, it would eventually be tracked back to him and he would be caught. This is what I believe happened that night. So he made an attempt to prevent me from passing. I have no idea what he would have done if he had caught me, but taking into account the fact that I was the sole witness, it is highly likely that he would not have committed the crime. Up till the point where I was never seen again. Nevertheless, his name and everything else did not add up to anything, which was a tremendous disappointment. It seemed quite probable that he was either an illegal immigrant or a felon of some type who had gone to the trouble of obtaining fraudulent or stolen identification cards and job documents. It was not something that I had anticipated happening at any point in time. However, for the most part, it is extremely improbable that I will ever see that man again. Story 9. I was 18 years old at the time and I was traveling by car from my hometown to the college that I wanted to attend. My inexpensive SUV had all of my belongings crammed into the trunk in the back seat of the vehicle. My anxiety was rather high because this was not only going to be my first time traveling for a long distance by myself, but it was also going to be the first time that I would be away from my family for an extended amount of time. In any case, the guidelines I was following stated that the whole distance would be 600 miles, which I would drive over the course of 2 days. It was estimated that I would arrive at the hotel around 11 o'clock at night, and I was following the path that the maps had instructed me to take. However, I was aware that I would most likely arrive much later than expected due to the possibility of traffic, the need to stop for petrol, and the need to purchase food. At 7, the sun had completely disappeared and the majority of the automobiles had also disappeared. I would occasionally see a car drive by, and when it did so, I would notice that the headlights of the vehicle gradually disappeared in front of me. For the majority of the journey, however, it was just me. In reality, this caused me to feel really exhausted and bored. When I was about 10 o'clock, I made the decision to pull over at the next gas station before continuing on with the rest of the journey. I got off the road and went into a gas station around 10 minutes, after what seemed like an eternity. Due to its remote location, this location was not even close to being a town, rather, it was little more than a petrol station that contained a few pumps and a small convenience shop. I was unable to spot any other vehicles on the road or in the parking lot, and I could not even notice any lights emanating from surrounding homes or buildings in the distance. In order to begin filling up my tank, I immediately pulled up to a pump and got out of my vehicle. During the time that I was looking about, I was almost startled by a man who was approaching me. When compared to me, he was significantly older, probably in his 50s, if I had to guess, and he appeared to be homeless because of his appearance. Nevertheless, the fact that I was approached outside of this location was not something that I had anticipated, and his brief smile did not make me feel any more at ease. "Do you require something more?" I inquired, hoping that he would not bring himself any closer. After coming to a stop a few feet away from my vehicle, the man took a look around with a degree of caution before responding. "To get back onto the highway, you should take the exit." I looked at him, perplexed, unsure of whether or not I was comprehending what he was saying. In addition to repeating himself, he pointed behind me at the exit that I had just come from. "To get back onto the highway, you should take the exit." After a little pause, I responded with a "okay," and the man then walked away. On the other hand, I was still really perplexed. It was a one-way road that I had to take in order to go back to the exit that he wanted me to use. As a result, according to his reasoning, he desired for me to drive on the opposite side of the road and then do a U-turn back onto the highway. Quite simply, it was completely illogical. When I looked out at the entrance road, which was the primary route that I was meant to use, I noticed that there were no indications of any work up on the road. It appeared to be nothing more than a vacant ramp leading back onto the freeway. As I was getting into my vehicle and putting the pump back where it belonged, I cast a peek in the direction of the man, who was now only sitting against the side of the convenience store. However, the more I thought about it, the more insane that man appeared to be. He was simply sitting here and making up these ridiculous statements. I was under the impression that this was some kind of trap or something. So I went with my gut and drove out of the parking lot and toward the entrance to the highway and headed in that direction. As I approached it, however, I became aware that the majority of the lighting were not functioning properly. While I was slowing down, I thought to myself that perhaps this was a construction zone or something. I made sure to keep my eyes on the road that was right in front of me and to be wary of anything that might come my way. Nevertheless, as I navigated my way down the dark road, I could only make out a faint outline of a person to my left. However, just as I was about to pass by, a pickup truck suddenly appeared out of nowhere and halted directly in front of my vehicle. 4 men came out of the truck and began sprinting up to my car while wielding a variety of weapons, including metal bats, machetes, and knives. Every door opened as they approached my vehicle. Additionally, there was nothing covering their faces at all. They appeared to be completely heartless, as if they had no feelings whatsoever as a result of what they were doing. As soon as they were only a few steps away from my windows, I immediately began backing up away from them. After I had retraced my steps a sufficient distance, I unexpectedly beheld the silhouettes of a large number of individuals emerging from the shadows along the side of the road. When I was desperately trying to get out of there, a handful of them even tried to chase after my car. I quickly turned back and sped off as soon as I was able to do so. As soon as I was confident that I was safe, I dialed 911, but for some reason I never received a call back. Absolutely no new information regarding it. It's almost as if they just didn't bother to check on it. I find it ironic that the scary old man at the gas station was the one who attempted to keep me from becoming involved in that situation in the first place. Or at least, that is what I believe he was doing. In any case, I am extremely fortunate to have been able to escape that situation with my life. Both what that was and what they were all preparing to accomplish are completely beyond my comprehension.